The storm hit as soon as they crossed into the desolate stretch of highway. Rain lashed against the windows of the old sedan as the wind howled like a wounded animal. Julia gripped the wheel tighter, trying to steady the car, her nerves rattled by the driving rain and the darkness that enveloped the road. Beside her, Mark sat quietly, occasionally glancing out the window at the flashes of lightning that lit up the night. "Maybe we should find a place to stay for the night," Julia suggested, her voice strained. "I don't want to risk driving through this mess." Mark looked around, but there was nothing but miles of empty road and blackness in every direction. Just as they were starting to worry, the faint glow of a neon sign appeared through the rain, a small roadside motel, the kind of place they used to see in old movies. The sign flickered, its buzzing sound almost drowned out by the storm. "There," Mark said, pointing. "Let's take a break." They pulled into the parking lot, their headlights illuminating the motel's peeling sign, the Willowbrook Inn. The building looked run down, as if it had been abandoned for years. Despite the eerie atmosphere, the warmth of the building's lights through the windows seemed like a welcome refuge from the storm. As they approached the front door, they noticed the place was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the rain and the occasional crack of thunder. Julia felt an odd chill run through her as they stepped inside. An old man stood behind the counter, his face wrinkled and pale. He smiled at them, his eyes too wide, as if he'd been waiting for them. "Checking in?" he asked, his voice raspy, like he hadn't spoken in days. "Yeah," Mark said, offering a small smile. "Just for the night. The storm's too much to drive in." The man nodded, handing over a key. "Room 3. Stay as long as you like. You'll be safe here." Julia didn't like the way the man's gaze lingered on them, but she didn't say anything. They took the key and made their way to the room, the damp air making the hallways feel colder than they should be. Room 3 was small but clean enough, though it had a strange smell, something musty and old, like forgotten memories. The furniture was dated, and the wallpaper was peeling. But after the long drive, it was a relief to be out of the storm. "We can deal with it for one night," Julia said, trying to shake off the unease she felt. Mark nodded, though he wasn't looking entirely comfortable either. They went to bed, the wind rattling the windows, and the sound of the storm pounding on the roof. Just as they were starting to drift off, the lights flickered and went out, leaving the room in complete darkness. The storm continued to rage outside, but now, it was accompanied by the low rumbling sound of something else. Julia's eyes snapped open. She couldn't place the noise, but it was distant, like a faint scream in the night. She sat up in bed, her breath shallow, but the room was still and quiet. Then, everything shifted. The walls of the room seemed to close in, and a low, oppressive weight settled in her chest. Julia turned to Mark, but he wasn't there. She blinked, trying to focus her eyes. The bed she was sitting in had changed. The furniture around her had changed. Everything around her was older, faded curtains, an old-fashioned clock on the wall that ticked loudly, and a phone that looked like it belonged in the 1950s. Panic rose in her throat. "Mark," she called, but her voice sounded foreign, swallowed by the strange air of the room. She scrambled to her feet and stumbled into the hallway, looking for Mark, but there was no sign of him. The hallway stretched longer than before, the shadows in the corners more menacing. The place looked even older now, dusty, dilapidated. The wallpaper had deteriorated completely, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her, soft but steady. She spun around and saw a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, like something out of the 1950s, walking toward her. His eyes were cold, empty, as if he didn't see her at all. "Can I help you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. But the man didn't answer. He walked past her, seemingly lost in his own world, heading for a door at the end of the hall. As she stood frozen, the strange sound of a bell rang through the building. It was like a warning, and as the sound echoed, the doors of the rooms opened. Inside, the occupants, other guests, all dressed in vintage clothing, emerged, going about their lives as if nothing had changed. Julia's head spun. She rushed to the door of the room where the man had gone, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned the knob and stepped inside. The room was on fire. The walls were ablaze, and the smoke was suffocating. She saw figures, shadows, people running. Then, she realized the truth. The fire had started here, in this motel, long ago. The figures she saw were people who had been trapped in the flames, their screams muffled by the roaring fire. In the chaos, Julia spotted Mark, or someone who looked like him, in the smoke. He was desperately trying to escape, but he didn't see her. It was like the entire night was playing out in front of her, and she was forced to relive it all: the tragedy, the fire, the people who died in that motel. Suddenly, it became clear. She wasn't just trapped in the motel, she was stuck in time. She was reliving the night of the fire, trapped in the year 1952, and the storm outside had somehow pulled her into this twisted version of reality. Desperate, she ran, trying to find a way out, but the walls kept shifting, the building twisting as if it didn't want her to leave. She could feel the fire's heat growing stronger, and the screams of the past filled her ears. She had to escape, before she became part of its tragic history. The air was thick, and the fire was closing in. Julia's heart raced as she finally found a door that led outside. But when she stepped out, she found herself back in the parking lot. The storm was gone, the air still and silent. But the motel had burned to the ground. The ruins of the building were all that remained, nothing but ashes and twisted metal. And Julia knew, somehow, she had escaped. But she wasn't sure for how long. Time was never the same after that night. The storm had stopped, but the echoes of the fire would never fade. As Julia stood outside the ruins of the motel, a heavy emptiness settled in her chest. Where is Mark? She kept asking herself, but no answer came. The memories of their drive, their plans for the future, felt like a distant dream now. Her mind raced with the thought that Mark was still trapped, reliving the horrors of that fire. The weight of it all hit her like a tidal wave, and guilt overwhelmed her. Had she failed him? Was he still out there, doomed to never escape the night? Tears welled up as she sank to her knees, unable to shake the haunting thought that Mark, or some part of him, could be lost forever in that cruel time loop. The trauma would stay with her, a scar that would never fade, and the idea of living with that uncertainty would haunt her for the rest of her life. Four friends, Ava, Ben, Emily, and Lucas, had been looking forward to their weekend camping trip for months. They loved the outdoors and relished the chance to escape the hustle and bustle of daily life. This weekend, they'd chosen a remote spot in the woods, far from the noise of civilization, where they could enjoy the silence of nature. The first day went as planned. They set up camp near a creek, built a fire, and spent the evening telling stories under the stars. The air was crisp, and the woods seemed peaceful, almost magical in its quiet solitude. They joked about how isolated they were, pretending that they were the only people left on Earth. But as night fell, the atmosphere began to change. A thick mist rolled into the forest, creeping slowly through the trees like a living thing. At first, it seemed harmless, just fog, but the deeper they ventured into the woods the next day, the more they realized something wasn't right. The mist lingered in odd patches, thickening in some places and thinning in others, as if it had a mind of its own. By the second evening, the friends noticed something disturbing. The same group of tall trees in the distance kept appearing, no matter how far they hiked. They'd walk for hours, only to find themselves coming back to the same clearing over and over again. The same trees, the same rock formations, even the same patch of moss. They couldn't understand it. No one had seen them turn around, yet here they were again. "I swear we passed this spot already," Ben said, his voice uneasy. "We've walked in a straight line for hours." Ava, trying to remain calm, suggested they might have gotten turned around. But after another hour of walking, they were once again back at the same clearing, and the unsettling sense of déjà vu grew stronger. Lucas, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke, his voice laced with fear. "Guys, this is wrong. This isn't just a coincidence." The next day, the friends decided to head back to camp, hoping to figure out what was happening. But when they arrived at their campsite, they found something even more disturbing. Their tent was gone. The fire pit had long since died, and their backpacks had vanished, as if they'd never existed. The forest felt too silent, too still. Panic set in. They began to search the area, calling out to each other, but no one answered. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. As they ventured deeper into the woods, each one began to hear whispers, low murmurs just beyond their hearing range, speaking words they couldn't understand. The air felt thick, suffocating, and the trees seemed to bend closer, as though watching them. Suddenly, everything stopped. The sound of the wind, the hum of insects, even the distant chirp of birds, it all fell into a suffocating silence. And then they heard it, the faint sound of footsteps, moving in rhythm with their own. It was subtle at first, a faint echo, but soon, it became undeniable. Someone was following them. Ava spun around, expecting to see another hiker, but there was no one there. The sound continued, growing louder as they walked, always 10 steps behind. Ben turned to the others, his face pale. "It's following us. It's us." He was right. The footsteps weren't someone else's. They were theirs, from the future. But they couldn't understand why or how. That night, as they sat huddled together, trying to make sense of what was happening, the mist returned with a vengeance. It wrapped around them, thick and unyielding. The forest seemed to shift, bending and twisting in ways they couldn't explain. The world around them began to warp and fold as if time itself was unraveling. And then, just as they began to despair, something even stranger happened. They saw themselves. 4 figures, standing in the mist, identical in every way. But their faces were hollow, their eyes filled with terror. They reached out to the group, wordlessly pleading for help. But when the friends stepped closer, they realized with a chilling certainty that the figures were not themselves, but future versions who had been trapped in this loop for an eternity. The same figures that had followed them, just 10 steps behind. They had all become part of the same time loop, doomed to relive the same events over and over again, never able to escape. The forest was not just a place, it was a prison, a point where time had become fractured, looping on itself. The mist was a manifestation of this cycle, and the footsteps, the eerie whispers, were all part of their own doomed future, forever chasing them. In the final moments, as they tried to flee, the forest closed in around them, and the last thing they saw was the same clearing they had passed through countless times. The trees loomed tall, and the footsteps echoed once more, always 10 steps behind, always following. The cycle had begun again. Daniel Prescott had always prided himself on his collection of rare and unusual artifacts. His home was a museum of curiosities, ancient masks, faded manuscripts, and peculiar trinkets that told forgotten stories. But none captivated him quite like the painting he found at an estate sale on a chilly autumn morning. It was unremarkable at first glance. A modest oil painting of a serene countryside, muted greens and blues under a pale sky. The frame was weathered, and a faint signature in the bottom corner read, "EV." What intrigued Daniel most was the small card that accompanied it. "The cursed painting. Do not keep it." He chuckled at the warning. To him, it was a gimmick, a ploy to add mystique. For $100, it was worth adding to his collection. The painting was hung in his study that evening, above an old oak desk. As Daniel sat working late into the night, he noticed a faint sound, a whisper, soft and almost imperceptible, like wind slipping through a crack. He paused, looking around the room. Nothing. The whispering continued sporadically over the next few days. At first, Daniel dismissed it as an overactive imagination or perhaps an issue with the house's insulation. But the sounds grew louder, more distinct. It was no longer a vague murmur but fragmented words, like a conversation just out of earshot. By the end of the week, the whispers seemed to come directly from the painting. Daniel approached it cautiously one night, his pulse racing. He leaned in, and for the first time, he caught a word clearly. "Help." Startled, he stumbled back. Rationality wrestled with unease. Was the sound coming from inside the frame? From the paint itself? Determined to uncover the truth, Daniel removed the painting from the wall and inspected it thoroughly. He found nothing unusual, no hidden speakers, no mechanisms. Yet the whispering persisted, even when the painting was locked away in his basement. As the days wore on, the whispers began to invade his dreams. He saw blurred faces, distorted voices pleading with him. "Listen, find us." Desperate for answers, Daniel returned to the estate where he had purchased the painting. The house was abandoned, but he managed to track down a neighbor who had known the family. The old man he spoke to was hesitant at first but eventually shared a grim tale. The painting belonged to Eleanor Vinton, he explained. She was a recluse who claimed the painting was cursed. Every owner before her suffered misfortunes, disappearances, madness, even death. She believed the painting trapped their souls. Trapped? Daniel repeated, a chill crawling up his spine. Eleanor said she could hear them whispering, begging for release. She tried to destroy it, but she failed. She died not long after. Armed with this chilling knowledge, Daniel resolved to rid himself of the painting. He first tried fire, placing it in the hearth and setting it alight. but the flames extinguished unnaturally, leaving the painting unscathed. He then tried tearing it apart with a knife, only for the blade to snap as though striking solid stone. Frustration turned to fear as the whispering grew louder, more insistent. "You're the key. Set us free." In a fit of desperation, Daniel researched everything he could about the artist, Eleanor Vinton, and the painting's origins. He discovered that Eleanor had been the last in a line of owners, each of whom had disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances. Each time, the painting had been passed along, as if it were seeking something, or someone. Late one night, as the whispering reached a crescendo, Daniel found a small, hidden compartment in the painting's frame. Inside was a folded piece of parchment, brittle with age. The words on it were faded but legible. "Only blood unbinds." He froze, the meaning sinking in. The painting demanded a sacrifice, his blood, to break its curse. Terrified but resolved, Daniel pricked his finger and let a drop of blood fall onto the canvas. The reaction was immediate. The painting seemed to ripple, the serene countryside distorting as shadowy figures emerged from the depths of the paint. Faces stared back at him, their expressions a mix of relief and sorrow. One by one, they whispered their thanks before dissolving into the air. When the last face disappeared, the painting faded to a blank canvas. The whispering ceased, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Though Daniel was relieved, he couldn't shake the feeling that the curse had left its mark on him. The painting was gone, but late at night, when the house was quiet, he sometimes thought he could still hear faint whispers, a reminder of the souls he had freed and the price he had yet to pay. It was Emma's first week working the night shift at Willowbrook Hospital. The corridors were always quiet, bathed in the soft glow of overhead lights. The only sound that could be heard was the soft beep of heart monitors, the occasional rustle of papers, and the distant hum of the hospital machinery. Most of the staff had already gone home, and Emma had been left to care for the few patients who remained. Her assignment for the night was unusual. She was tasked with taking care of a patient, Mr. Harrison, who had been in a coma for years. His case was one that had baffled the doctors. No one could figure out why he hadn't woken up, and no one could offer any explanation for his prolonged state. But, as the only nurse available, Emma was to check on him regularly and ensure he was comfortable. The room where Mr. Harrison was kept was cold and sterile, tucked away at the far end of the hospital's old wing. It had always given Emma an uneasy feeling. The walls were cracked, and the windows were too high to see anything outside. A faint smell of antiseptic hung in the air. She'd been told he was the only patient in that wing, which made the silence even more oppressive. She walked into his room and adjusted the IV drip. Mr. Harrison lay motionless in his bed, his pale skin almost blending with the white sheets. He hadn't moved in years, but there was something unsettling about the way his eyes were always slightly open, as if watching her. She had tried to avoid looking at his face too long. It was as if he could see her, even though he didn't react. Emma settled into a chair beside the bed, her eyes occasionally flicking to the clock. The hours dragged on, and the silence was unbearable. That was when she heard it, the softest whisper. It was barely audible, but it sent a shiver down her spine. Emma froze. She had been alone in the room with Mr. Harrison for hours, but she had never heard anything like this before. The voice was distant, like a faint echo, but it felt so real. Her heart began to race as she glanced nervously at the door, half expecting someone to be standing there. There was no one, only the shadows that stretched across the room, casting eerie shapes on the walls. She shook her head, trying to convince herself it was just the strain of the night shift playing tricks on her mind. Minutes passed, and the whispers grew louder. They came from all around her, but she couldn't find their source. She glanced down at Mr. Harrison, who, despite his comatose state, seemed to be staring directly at her. His eyes were still open, but now they were unnervingly wide. "Leave me," the voice whispered again, clearer this time. "I'm not who you think I am." A cold chill swept over Emma. She stood up, her legs trembling. The whisper was now accompanied by the sound of something scraping against the floor, like nails dragging across wood. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She backed away slowly, but her gaze never left the patient in the bed. His once peaceful face was now contorted into something unsettling. His skin had grown paler, and his fingers twitched. Just then, the lights flickered. The whispers stopped. The room fell deathly silent, but Emma's heart was pounding in her chest. She could feel something watching her, something that didn't belong. Suddenly, the door swung open, and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was a tall man, dressed in a long coat, his face hidden in the shadows. His presence seemed to fill the room with an oppressive weight. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, his voice low and hoarse. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. Who was this man? And why was he in the hospital at this hour? He stepped forward, his eyes glowing with an unsettling light. "He's not human," the man said, his voice sharp. "What you're seeing, it's not real. You need to leave before it's too late." The man's warning only intensified Emma's fear, but before she could respond, he turned and vanished into the shadows, as if he had never been there at all. Emma was left standing in the dark, her heart hammering in her chest. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, wanting to call for help. But when she checked the time, she realized that hours had passed since the man had appeared, hours that she couldn't account for. The clock on the wall seemed to mock her, its hands frozen in place. Then, she heard the whispers again, but this time, they were different. They sounded closer, almost as if they were coming from inside her mind. She looked back at Mr. Harrison, and her blood ran cold. His face had changed completely. His once lifeless eyes were now black and empty, like two dark voids staring straight through her. His mouth curled into a twisted smile, and his fingers twitched erratically, as if reaching for her. "You should have left," he whispered, his voice no longer faint but strong, filled with malice. "Now, it's too late." In a panic, Emma rushed to the door, but it wouldn't open. She yanked on the handle, her heart racing as she heard the scraping noise grow louder, closer. The whispers became a cacophony of voices, all speaking in unison, all saying the same thing: "You're mine now." Suddenly, the lights flickered again, this time much more violently, until they went out completely. Emma stumbled in the dark, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. Her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. She turned and saw Mr. Harrison's hand, extended toward her. But it wasn't human. It had grown longer, with sharp, claw-like fingers, reaching out from the bed. "I've waited so long," the voice whispered, now coming from the bed itself. "You should have listened." In the darkness, Emma could hear nothing but the sound of her own heartbeat, frantic and wild. She didn't know what was real anymore. Was it the patient? The man who warned her? Or was it something far worse? She slammed her fist against the door once more, and this time, it creaked open, the hallway light spilling into the room. Emma bolted for the exit, her mind reeling. She didn't look back, not once, as she ran out of the room, down the corridor, and into the main lobby. But as she passed the nurse's station, she stopped short. The chart for Mr. Harrison was missing. And the nurse who had worked the previous shift? Gone. There was no record of any staff member named Emma. Everything in Willowbrook Hospital had shifted. Something ancient and dark had been waiting, and now, it had her too. Nestled high in the mountains, the Blackridge Hotel was the perfect escape for Claire and Evan, a newlywed couple looking for a peaceful retreat. The journey had been long and winding, with icy roads and dense fog, but the sight of the grand, isolated lodge with its warm glow was worth it. The receptionist greeted them warmly, handing them the key to room 307. "You're our only guests tonight," she said with a smile. "Enjoy the quiet." The hotel was charming but old, its hallways lined with black and white photographs of past guests and events. As Claire and Evan explored, the creak of the wooden floors echoed eerily. The staff had mentioned a snowstorm was coming, and the rising winds outside made the windows shudder. After dinner in the empty dining hall, the couple decided to take a stroll through the hotel's winding corridors. As they turned a corner, they nearly bumped into an elderly man shuffling down the hall. He was hunched over, wearing a faded suit, and his eyes seemed distant, almost hollow. "You should leave," he muttered, his voice gravelly. Claire and Evan exchanged uneasy glances. "Excuse me?" Evan asked. "Before the clock strikes midnight," the old man continued, gripping Evan's arm with surprising strength. "Go. Don't look back." Before they could respond, he shuffled away, disappearing into the shadows of the hall. Disturbed, the couple returned to their room, locking the door behind them. They tried to laugh it off. Perhaps he was just a confused old man, a resident who had wandered into the guest areas. But his words lingered. At exactly midnight, a loud crash jolted them awake. It came from the hallway. Evan grabbed a flashlight and opened the door cautiously. The hallway was empty, but further down, a flickering light illuminated one of the photographs on the wall. Curiosity got the better of them, and they approached the glowing picture. It was a group shot of hotel guests, dated 1923. There, in the back row, stood the elderly man they'd seen earlier, looking exactly the same. "That's impossible," Claire whispered. "He couldn't be in this photo." They hurried to the front desk to alert the receptionist, but the desk was deserted. The lobby, once cozy and warm, now felt cold and oppressive. The howling wind outside grew louder, almost as if voices were carried within it. The couple decided to leave immediately. They packed their bags in record time and rushed to the lobby, only to find the massive front doors wouldn't budge. It was as if they'd been sealed shut. Then they heard it. The sound of slow, shuffling footsteps coming from the staircase. Claire clutched Evan's arm as the elderly man emerged from the shadows. "I warned you," he said. his voice a low rumble. Now, it's too late. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the hotel into darkness. When they flickered back on, the man was gone, but the whispers began. Faint at first, growing louder, voices surrounded them, echoing through the halls. "Stay with us," the voices urged. "Join us." Terrified, the couple ran deeper into the hotel, looking for another exit. But the layout seemed to change with every turn. Hallways looped back on themselves, doors led to nowhere, and the whispers grew more insistent. They found themselves back in the lobby, facing the grand staircase. Above it, a massive portrait hung, one they hadn't noticed before. It was of the elderly man, his name inscribed on a plaque, Walter Hensley, founder of the Blackridge Hotel. Underneath the portrait, an inscription read, "A place to escape time." The whispers grew deafening as shadowy figures began to materialize in the room, ghostly guests of the hotel, their eyes empty and faces expressionless. Claire screamed as one of the figures reached for her, its hand cold as ice. Evan pulled her back, and together they stumbled into a nearby room, slamming the door shut behind them. Inside, they found another photograph, dated 1942. Among the group of smiling faces were two unmistakable figures, Claire and Evan, staring back at them with vacant eyes. "No." Claire whispered, her knees buckling. "This can't be real." The door creaked open, and the elderly man stood there once more. "Welcome to the Blackridge," he said. "You're one of us now." The lights flickered again, and when they steadied, the couple was gone. The hotel returned to its eerie silence, ready to welcome its next visitors. The next morning, the receptionist found two new faces in the old photographs hanging on the walls of the lobby. Two faces she didn't recognize, yet somehow, they seemed to belong.